How much do you know about Article 3 and the court system? I have a feeling we're going to hear a lot more from the courts in the upcoming weeks, so I figured now is the time to explain a little bit more about it to you. I'm Brian, I make videos about civics and law. Please share, comment, repost, do all the stuff to get this out there so people will see it. This is your law too, you deserve to understand it. Okay, today I'm talking about courts, and specifically federal courts. State courts, kind of their own deal. Federal courts is such a complicated concept that it has its own class in law school. So we're going to stick to one little idea at a time, get through that, and then we'll move on to something else. So if you listen to something I say and you're like, he didn't mention this, it's because I'm going to get to it in another video and I want to keep things simplified. All right, I'm going to start with a couple of things we've gone through before, but I think we should do again just as a refresher. At the bottom of the federal court system, we have a ton of district courts. Ta-da! Okay, so we've got our district courts. These are at the bottom. District courts are what you see on TV. It's where all the exciting things happen. The evidence, the juries, the attorneys, the judges, the I object, all that stuff, all in the district courts down here at the bottom. District courts are broken up into small groups by region, like a few states are broken up into what we call a circuit. Circuits. Each circuit is overseen by one circuit court of appeals. Boom. Court of appeals. And of course, all of the court of appeals are overseen by one Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, who I sometimes like to refer to as the black robes, even though all of the judges are really wearing black robes. Okay, federal system, 3 levels of court: district, circuit court of appeals, and the Supreme Court. There are also some specialized courts like bankruptcy courts and tax courts. They actually do fit into this same system, but we're going to ignore them for today and just stick with the basic idea. We got this, right? Okay, we know the layout of the federal courts, but now we're going to go back to our map of the Constitution, because what we're really talking about today is the constitutional architecture of our court system. And don't worry if those words sound weird, they'll make sense in a few minutes. All right, we're back to our familiar map of federalism, but we're not doing anything below the wall today, so I've moved it down a little bit. Everything we talk about is going to be in the federal government. For those of you who don't know, federalism is what separates the federal government from pretty much everything else. States, people, whatever. And so this is our wall of federalism in our map. Today we are only talking about what goes on inside the national federal government. Again, for those of you who are new, these are the 7 articles of the Constitution, the first 3 of which each lay out a branch of our government. I think the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria? No. Article 1 lays out the rules for the legislative branch. Article 2 lays out the rules for the executive branch. Article 3 lays out the rules for the judicial branch. And these orange walls here represent the separation of powers, dividing the different branches of government from each other. Unfortunately, I have some bad news for fans of this map, because it's about to get a little more complicated as we start looking at the court system. We're going to have to replace our nice clean walls with a game of tic-tac-toe, or something that looks like it anyway. I know, I'm sad to see it go too. Alright, as I start to talk about this, I think you'll see why I segmented this off into its own video. Let's take a look at our Constitution. Amendment, signatures, Governor Morris, ex post facto, two Charles Pickneys? Alright, Article 3. Article 3 doesn't give us all the details of, say, an Article 1 or even an Article 2. Article 3 is a lot more sketchy. But Article 3 does one thing for certain. The first line of Article 3, Section 1, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. So Article 3, Section 1 sets up the Supreme Court in the judiciary. Pow! So what about all the district courts and the courts of appeal? Once it sets up the Supreme Court, Article 3 doesn't actually set up any more courts. It's actually a really major point in a case called Martin versus Hunter's Lessee, which is like a huge case that I made another video about, but I may come back to later. So where did all these other courts come from? The district court, the appeals court, where'd they come from? Well, let me go back and reread the sentence from Article 3. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The permissive language there, may, means that Congress doesn't have to do anything. And that was the key point in Martin versus Hunter's Lessee. Because the Constitution only requires one court, the rest of them were left up to Congress to decide whether we needed them or not. So what does that mean for our tic-tac-toe board? Well, the Supreme Court is kind of set up on its own in the judiciary by Article 3. But Congress is given the right under Article 3 to set up the other 2 courts, which means that Congress has a lot of control over these lower courts. These lower courts still answer judicially to the Supreme Court, but they answer administratively to Congress. But if only the complexity ended here. I will give you a hint about where we're headed next. All of these courts are known as Article 3 courts. And there are a few other pieces of information in Article 3 that tell us some very important information about the Article 3 courts. There's some stuff about jurisdiction, but that's a whole other video. Most people know that Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, but actually all Article 3 judges are appointed for life, because it's right here in Article 3. Regardless of whether or not the court was created under Congress. All right, you ready to leave Article 3 but stay in the federal court system? It's going to get fun. Okay, we're going to start with what are called Article 2 courts or executive tribunals. Here's the thing about Article 2 courts. They may not exist. They're more of a historical anomaly than they are a thing. They're not a power of the president, they're just something the president has done a couple of times in the past due to extraordinary circumstances. Every one of these tribunals was set up by federal authorities who were occupying territory during some sort of an armed conflict. So, for example, during the Mexican War of 1846, a lot of these were during the Civil War. My understanding is that in each one of these cases, there was a need for a federal court for some reason, but we were not on land that was owned by the United States, so there was no federal court system in place in that area. Therefore, the executive set up some sort of a special court to deal with whatever was going on. Even the people who recognize that this ever existed see this as a huge overreach of presidential power. This is universally seen as something that is not allowed to be done. But it's important to know that in our tic-tac-toe board, it's something that may have existed at some point, depending on how you look at things. Now, the last place we're going to look is Article 1, because Congress has set up a lot of courts that are not part of the Article 3 system. So what does that mean? They've set up specific courts as part of some piece of legislation or another, but they haven't inserted them into this Article 3 system. So the judges aren't appointed for life, certain constitutional protections might not exist. These are generally a different style of court. The most common term used to describe Article 1 courts are as legislative courts. Courts that are set up through specific legislation for a specific purpose, but aren't necessarily part of the Article 3 courts. So, example, let's say I'm a federal employee. Federal employees get due process before they can be fired. And that sort of thing is usually written up in their manual. Maybe if I do something wrong, I get a demerit. If I get so many demerits, I have to have a meeting with my supervisor. And if I have a couple of meetings and we don't resolve things, then I can be terminated. But built into that process, there's usually some levels of review. So for example, my file with all the paper records of me being written up in the meetings with my boss might be forwarded to my boss's boss, who might give it a second review and decide whether my boss is just kind of a heel or I really did deserve to get fired. And let's say after my review by the supervisor is denied, I feel like I've been fired unfairly and I decide I want to take it to court. Well, Congress has added an extra layer between the supervisor and court. They decided they wanted to have an impartial person who had nothing to do with our situation sit down with the paperwork, maybe talk to me, talk to my boss, and make sure that this was really being done because I'd done something wrong and not because my boss was a jerk before we went all the way to the court system. And so they created an extra little court in the middle there, and it's called an Administrative Law Judge Court, an ALJ. So an ALJ who doesn't know any of us, in theory, is going to sit down and review the administrative record, and we'll have a little trial. It's not the same as a big Article 3 trial, but it is a trial, and we'll be in a courtroom in front of an administrative law judge. But that administrative law judge is an Article 1 judge, not an Article 3 judge, because Congress wrote a special law to set up this extra court, and they created judges for it. And that's something that Congress can do. Another example of an Article 1 court is the local court system in the District of Columbia, or at least most of it. Because most states get to set up their own local court system, but DC isn't a state. So Congress decided, well, we don't want a federal court having to deal with everything going on locally, so we're going to allow you to set up a local court system like the states have, but you don't have any sort of a constitutional right to one. So instead, we're going to have to write a special law that creates a court just for you. And that court system is right here under Article 1. Territorial courts, like the court system in Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands, are Article 1 courts. There are plenty of other examples of Article 1 courts operating in the United States. You may not even know if you walk in. It's going to kind of look like a courtroom. But in some cases, it is important to know whether a court gets its authority from Article 1 or Article 3. This is all stuff that's going to come down the pipeline. I just wanted to introduce you to the concept now before we get there. Travis, Shannon, Wendy, thank you so much for sending me stuff. I really appreciate it. Everybody who's helping me out, you guys are keeping me going. You guys are the only reason I can keep doing this, so I really appreciate it. Again, please share this with your friends. Comment if you have any questions or any thoughts on this. I will be moving a little bit further into the courts as we go along, but this was kind of foundational, and I wanted to sort of explain it on its own. All right, thanks a lot, guys. As long as you keep watching them, I'll keep making them. Thanks.